Hello, everybody. I'm very excited for the conversation that I'm about to have right now. I'm talking to lawyer, journalist, author, and co founder of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald. Glenn, thanks so much for joining me, man. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be here. I haven't been called a lawyer, at least not first in a really long time, so that's a little hurtful. But I'm so excited to be back on Secular Talk. It's been, I think, 2 years that I've been waiting for an invitation to come back, that I'm going to overlook that in my excitement and happiness.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. And, you know, I would literally talk to you for like 3 or 4 hours if I could, but let's focus on the really big news that just happened. So I don't know much about Brazilian politics. I know pretty much what I've read in The Intercept, and that's it. I consider you somewhat of an expert on Brazilian politics. I mean, you live in Brazil, and I always see you tweeting about it. Um, it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks yesterday with the election. Apparently, a guy who some people are describing as a fascist got elected. So, what I want to do is talk to you about number one, do you really consider him a fascist? And number two, how did we get to this point?
So, just to put things in context about why this whole discussion matters, there are two reasons. One is that Brazil is actually the fifth most populous country on the planet, the world's fourth largest democracy, the seventh largest economy. It's the biggest country in all of Latin America, and it has major oil reserves. So it has incredible geopolitical significance, and also it's just a huge and influential country, both regionally and globally. And politics is just generally global these days, and so very little that happens is confined to the borders of any one country. I personally use the term fascist very sparingly. I don't, for example, use it for Donald Trump, even though I think he has some fascist tendencies or parts of his mentality are inclined toward a kind of fascist ethos. In terms of his ideology and what he has done and what he is able to do, I would be very reluctant to apply that word to him, but I most certainly apply it to Jair Bolsonaro. And I think that who's now the president-elect of that very large and influential country I was just describing. And I think part of the problem has been that the Western media is able to understand, especially the American media, other countries, especially complicated ones that they don't spend much time focusing on, like Brazil, through a very self-absorbed lens. And so this idea that Bolsonaro is Brazil's Trump or the Trump of the tropics, two cliches that have become popularized over the past several months to try and understand him, are wildly inaccurate. He's much more like, say, the Philippines president Rodrigo Duterte, and probably even more extreme than him. I think the best current model, would be the Egyptian dictator General Sisi. He comes out of this kind of lineage that Trump or Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, other like modern alt-right leaders don't come from, which is the 1960s and 1970s Cold War, the idea that you commit atrocities in the name of fighting communism. That's still Bolsonaro's view of the world, that's the number one threat to Brazil. And he was part of a military dictatorship that lasted until 1985. He views that military dictatorship, which summarily executed critics, detained dissidents, closed media outlets, used torture systematically, was supported by the U.S. and the U.K., as the superior model of government to democracy, and has said that repeatedly, that he wants to bring Brazil back to that period, that really dark period in its recent history of the military dictatorship.
Would you say that Brazilian institutions are strong enough to withstand like a total authoritarian takeover? And I want to refer to a few quotes of Bolsonaro. He said in 1993, quote, "I am in favor of a dictatorship." When he was asked in 1999 if you were the president of the republic today, would you close the National Congress? He responded, "There's no doubt about it. I do a coup on the same day. The Congress doesn't work, and I'm sure at least 90% of the population would throw a party, would applaud because it does not work. Congress today is good for nothing, brother. It just votes for what the president wants. If he is the person who decides, who rules, who trumps the Congress, then let's have a coup quickly and go straight to dictatorship." So I guess my question is, how much of this, looking back at it, do you think that that's a little bit hyperbolic and that he'll actually do that? Or do you think it's possible that the Brazilian institutions withstand an authoritarian takeover, and that Bolsonaro, even though he'll likely be horrendous, he won't actually become a dictator?
So, and just to be clear, that those series of comments that you read, he's been saying the same thing, even throughout the campaign, the last speech that he gave before the vote on Sunday, which he delivered by cell phone because he was almost fatally stabbed the month before and so hasn't been able to travel, was one in which he vowed to cleanse the country of what he called the red bandits, by which he means the Brazilian left, and said that Brazil will have a cleansing unlike any seen in its history, and that the only choices for those who refuse to submit to his rule will be prison, death, or exile. So he's been very consistent in his ideology through the years. The question that you asked, I think, is the most important one and the one that everyone here in Brazil is asking. And it's the main reason why I really reject and resist this comparison to Trump, because even if you want to believe that Trump deep in his heart is like Sisi, Duterte, or Bolsonaro or whatever, the reality is that American democracy is 230 years old. There's all kinds of very powerful and established institutions that have been much more vibrant than probably ever before in pushing back against him, whether it be the media, the judiciary that has repeatedly declared acts of his unconstitutional, and probably most importantly and impressively of all, citizen protest. In Brazil, that's the opposite. Brazil is a democracy that's only 33 years old, so it's, I don't know how old you are, but
I'm
it's
30,
roughly your
yeah.
age.
It's close to my age.
Yeah, it's very close to my age too. So, it's a very young democracy. Roughly half of the public was actually born into a military dictatorship, and a lot of the people of Bolsonaro's generation were part of it. And so not only are Brazilian institutions very young and therefore very fragile, we don't have generation upon generation upon generation being inculcated with democratic values. People are remembering 40 years ago and they're saying, I wasn't a dissident, I wasn't tortured, I wasn't killed. It seems like that would be better. On top of everything else, you have a convergence of extremely grave crises. An economic crisis that originated from the 2008 financial collapse and has caused Brazil's worst recession in history, 13 million people unemployed. You have a massive corruption scandal where almost every leading party and members of the billionaire class have been hauled off to prison or indicted, not for kind of isolated corruption, like I'll give you $100,000 if you vote for this bill, but systemic corruption. I have $15 million in a Swiss bank account because I caused these contracts to go to these oligarchs. So you have a complete collapse in the faith of the institutions to handle the economy, and it's destroyed people's economic future, and the credibility and legitimacy of the institution because of the corruption scandal. And then you also have a massive epidemic of violent crime. 60,000 people a year or last year were murdered in Brazil. And just to give you a statistic, if you're a Rio de Janeiro city police officer, the chances that you're likely to die tomorrow are higher than the chances were that a U.S. soldier would be killed at the peak of the violence in the Iraq War. So when you have a convergence of crises along those lines, those institutions become decimated because they're plagued with all kinds of dysfunction and corruption. The public has completely turned their backs on them. And so the only institution that has any kind of popularity, which is very dangerous, and actually in the U.S. you see this starting to happen as well, is the military. That's the only institution that people really trust. For a while, the military was kind of embarrassed by Bolsonaro because they were trying to shed the stain of the military dictatorship and be rehabilitated as a force that defends the Constitution and democracy. But this year, the top level of the military and all of the lower ranks more or less consolidated in unison behind him. And so they're really the only institution, the only faction that has the power to impose limits on his worst nightmare scenarios. And whether they are sufficiently instilled with the idea that their patriotic duty is to defend the Constitution and democracy still, or whether they've kind of been converted with a lot of the rest of the population into the idea that Brazil's society problems are so grave that you need military order and rule, which is what led to the first military coup in 1964, remains to be seen. Nobody knows how the military, what their posture will be. And for now, Bolsonaro has a massive democratic mandate. He has a huge part of the population behind him. His party or his movement, aligned with his ideology, took over major parts of Congress, state houses, politics all up and down the political spectrum. So he doesn't really need at the moment to abandon the pillars of democracy to institute a lot of his more extremist visions because he has so much popular support for it, because the population has just turned its back on the ruling class, largely for good reason.
So let's talk a little bit about the Amazon. I've read in the wake of his victory that he plans to basically do a lot of privatization and basically open up the Amazon to Western developers. Is that true? And how devastating would that be for, say, the climate?
It's absolutely true. Bolsonaro did something really shrewd, which is, aside from the military, obviously a faction that wields a lot of power in Brazil is the plutocratic class. And they've always been extremely wary of Bolsonaro because he's kind of like a Donald Trump figure, but even more on the fringes of the mainstream. And so what he did was, about 6 months ago, he said, look, I don't know anything about economic and industrial policy. I'm a captain in the army. I know about public security. I know how to keep law and order. I know about foreign policy, and I know about social issues because I'm a man of God on my third marriage with kids with each of my increasingly younger wives. So that's what he said he knows. He said, I don't know anything about economic or industrial policy. So he hired an economic guru. He said he would empower to be kind of a super minister of the economy named Paulo Guedes. And Paulo Guedes is this kind of caricature from what was called the University of Chicago School, or the Chicago Boys that privatized all of South America during the Cold War, that sold off all the national resources of Chile under Pinochet, who Bolsonaro explicitly admires. And the markets ever since have loved Bolsonaro. Every time a new poll comes out showing Bolsonaro increasing his lead, this Brazilian stock market would explode. The Brazilian real would get stronger. And in the wake of his victory, even like the CBC, the state-owned and run media outlet in Canada, was running headlines, multiple ones, saying things like, well, Bolsonaro is a homophobic, racist, misogynist, and many believe he's a fascist, but what opportunities does this open up for Canadian investors or Canadian mining and logging interests? So one of Paulo Guedes is sort of like the wet dream of international capital and the plutocratic class. He wants to privatize everything. And Brazil has an immense amount of natural resources and state-owned industries that have funded the minimal social programs that they have. And they're going to have a privatization party, where they're going to strip everything out of the public treasury and sell it off to China, to U.S. oligarchs, to Germans, to anybody who essentially wants to buy it. There's going to be massive graft as part of it. And you're absolutely right. One of the main natural resources of Brazil, on which climate stability depends globally, is the Amazon. For a long time, Brazil was one of the stalwart protectors of the environment, of the Amazon. But there's been rapid deforestation in the Amazon, and that absolutely is going to accelerate. And just today, Bolsonaro announced that he was going to consolidate the Ministry of the Economy, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Environment all into one super ministry, which Paulo Guedes is going to run. So they're putting the entire industrial and economic policy under his authority. And he's as much of an extremist as Bolsonaro, just not quite as shocking because he's a University of Chicago trained economist and therefore has these kind of mainstream credentials. But that's why fascism is really the right word, because you have the three pillars of it: kind of militaristic law and order, evangelical religious fanaticism, and this appeal to patriotism as part of it, and this unified nation, and then the merger of corporate and industrial policy with this political agenda. It's kind of the classic case of academic fascism, what you study in graduate programs that fascism means, but also fascism in its more colloquial ethos.
Okay, so I have a lot to say about that. That's all right. Let's talk a little bit about Bolsonaro's opponent, Haddad, and then also let's touch on the former president in Brazil, Lula. Now, I'm going to tell you my understanding of it, which is unquestionably incorrect, and then you can, correct everything for me. Now,
I can mock you for all of your errors.
That's right. Yes, please.
Okay,
but I'm more than willing to take the mockery.
Okay.
All right. So my understanding is that Lula, so he was the head of the Workers' Party. He was president of Brazil. And my understanding is that he was relatively social democratic. Am I good so far?
You mean you're trying to place the Workers' Party on a kind of familiar ideological spectrum?
Yes.
So let me just then interject there, because it's a really important part of whatever you're going to ask. And I think it's a really important thing to recognize. So the Workers' Party was created as a real left-wing party. Lula himself came from extreme poverty. He was illiterate until he was 10. He was a labor leader. He lost a finger working in a factory because of terrible labor conditions. So he was kind of the real deal as far as being a radical left-wing labor activist. He led strikes. He went to prison for a short time under the military dictatorship. He ran for president 3 times in that carnation and lost 3 times. So in 2002, he said, I'm going to kind of do what Bill Clinton did. I'm going to remake the Workers' Party as a more moderate, business-friendly party. He chose as his vice presidential running mate a very kind of establishment-friendly, pro-banker, longtime financier to reassure international capital markets and Brazil's financial class that PT, the Workers' Party, was going to be a business-friendly party. And then he wrote this famous letter to the Brazilian people in 2002 in which he said, I want you to know I'm not the radical Lula that I once was. I've matured. I realize now that we all need to work together. Business can't be our enemy. We need to all grow together. And so that was very much the ruling ethos of where the Workers' Party under first Lula and then under his handpicked successor, Dilma Rousseff, who was even more radical than Lula in her youth. She was a Marxist guerrilla, imprisoned and tortured by the military dictatorship for taking up arms against it. But by the time she became president, she was a very technocratic, moderate. And so while it's true that they did some social programs that helped people come out of poverty, a lot of people come out of poverty, they were also being funded by all of the oligarchs and banks and the plutocratic class that ended up swept up in this corruption scandal that had been funding the party. Those rich people did even better under the Workers' Party than they did previously. And so while they lifted a lot of people out of poverty, barely, they also made sure that the rich prospered just as much. So you can kind of analogize it to the Democratic Party in the U.S. I'd be a little careful about making that comparison too much because it doesn't translate fully, but it's in broad strokes, it's accurate.
Okay, and Lula was brought down by a corruption scandal, and I'm unsure as to how real that is, because I've heard comparisons where they say, well, like Bernie Sanders' wife has been accused of being involved with corruption with some college or something, and it seems kind of like a mucked up thing. How real is the corruption scandal against Lula? Is it real, or is it something that was used politically by the right and weaponized to bring him down?
So I don't think it's exactly either of those things. So on the one hand, Lula has presided over a political system that is systemically and fundamentally corrupt. And that's true of his party and the political system over which he presided. So there's a lot of serious corruption allegations against Lula that have yet to be tried in court, and therefore he's entitled to the presumption of innocence. There's probably 5 or 6 of them that allege major, high-level, full-scale corruption. There's been this one tiny little nitpicky case that nobody ever took seriously that is really simple. It simply alleges that a construction company deeded a triplex apartment to Lula in exchange for favors that he did for them. So it's just like a very, unlike these complicated, difficult, broad corruption cases that people take seriously, this one's a really simple, clear transaction. This is the one they chose to prosecute first. And the reason is that all polls showed that Lula was likely to win the presidential race this year if he had run again, which he was going to do. And under Brazilian law, if somebody is convicted of a crime and then that conviction is upheld on appeal, so you have 2 instances where a court has said the person is guilty, they're automatically barred from running for any political office. So they rushed to make sure that Lula was convicted as quickly as possible of this extremely dubious case. There's no deed in his name, for example, that he was even the owner of the apartment. He never lived in this apartment. It's kind of a shitty triplex. They called it triplex all the time to make it seem glamorous. It does have 3 floors, but it's very kind of dreary. Lula got very rich because when he left office, he was of the stature of Obama or Tony Blair, like a very well-regarded by the mainstream political leader who did a speaking circuit. He made millions of dollars. He could have bought that triplex 20 times over. So that case is extremely dubious. And the way in which they prosecuted it so fast, reeked of political motives, namely a desire to make sure he couldn't run because of the fear that he would win if he did. So if you ask me in a theological sense, is Lula corrupt? I can't tell you yes or no because the really serious allegations have yet to be tested in court. The case for which he was actually imprisoned, in which he's now in prison and has been given a 12-year sentence, and his hope for a pardon just disappeared with the election outcome, which means he's likely to rot in prison, as Bolsonaro called it, for the next 4 years at least, is very, very, very dubious. I would go so far as to say illegitimate, because it was clearly politically motivated without much evidence, and designed to bar him from running.
So is it true that Lula, despite everything you just ran through there, that he was the most liked politician in Brazil?
Well, it was true. Lula's presidency was actually a miracle. So under his presidency, tens of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. They instituted a new social program that was innovative and hailed by economists across the spectrum all over the world, called Bolsa Familia, where it was in some senses like a welfare program to keep people out of poverty, but in order to receive the payment, they had to provide certification that their children were attending schools, were getting vaccines, a whole kind of list of things that the government wanted parents to do in order to take care of their children, make sure their children were getting an education and the like. And so it was kind of considered innovative. It lifted a lot of people out of poverty. They funded scholarships for colleges and universities so that poor people who never previously had any chance of going to school, to school after high school, were able to do so. They got the World Cup and the Olympics, both in Rio de Janeiro, because it was a sign that Brazil was experiencing this amazing economic growth and was kind of a miracle finally fulfilling its potential. They were finding huge oil reserves. There was this incredible nationalistic sense that Brazil had finally arrived. So when Lula left office in 2010, he had an 86% approval rating. 86%. Wow. He was by far the most popular world leader. When Barack Obama came to Brazil to meet with Lula, he said, I don't know what your magic is, but this is the guy who has figured it all out, which was true. Lula was a giant as a statesman and was beloved by enormous numbers of people. And then it just all kind of fell apart. The economy went into the toilet under his handpicked successor. The corruption scandal convinced a lot of former supporters that he was dirty and corrupt. And then it ultimately led to his imprisonment. As all the wheels came off the cart, his handpicked successor ultimately got impeached in 2016 under very dubious circumstances as well. So there was an effort to destroy PT by the elite of this country that had tried for so long to do it and couldn't. They finally were able to opportunistically exploit the crises. And in order to do that, they had to dismantle the reputation of Lula. So by the time 2018 came and he was ready to run, even though he was sort of leading in the polls, he was doing that as a drastically reduced figure, not even close to the stature that he had previously enjoyed.
Is it your opinion, because I was seeing this on Twitter after Bolsonaro's victory, is it your opinion that Lula would have beaten Bolsonaro?
It's the would Bernie have won question, right? So
it is analogous somewhat to that question.
Yeah, where you can form opinions based on speculation, but you'll never fully know, right?
So I have strong opinions on the Bernie one. I think I know the answer to that
I think your YouTube comments are going to fill up with anger at me for suggesting that the answer to that question is anything other than 100% certain. I certainly believe that Bernie would have won, and I wrote in March of 2016 that the Democrats were taking a huge gamble with Trump looming by choosing the candidate who was most likely to lose to him instead of the one that was most likely to beat him. And it's really weird because Democrats ignored that advice and now are angry at the people who gave that advice. I don't know why, but that's just how it is. I think there's an argument. Certainly the polling data showed if you up until 3 or 4 months ago when polls were still being taken on Lula before he was barred, if there's a runoff system in Brazil, so if one candidate in the first round fails to get 50%, like in France, the top two candidates go to a runoff. So the polls showed that Bolsonaro and Lula would make the runoff, and the polls, when you asked them who would you vote for, Lula or Bolsonaro, Lula had something like a 15 to 20 point lead, like 54 to 36, something like that.
That's a pretty big lead.
it's a big lead, but at the same time, Bolsonaro skyrocketed in the polls from that moment. And a lot of early polling is often inaccurate. I think that this was just a convergence of opportunities, and the moment came where the population had enough.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Bolsonaro, and it wasn't just Haddad who lost. Any politician, even previously popular ones, who were just too associated with the old kind of politics got destroyed, even if it meant putting into office people that nobody had ever heard of.
Yeah, see, Bernie was not the status quo, whereas based off everything we've spoken about to this point, even though he may have been good in some ways and maybe not so good in others, Lula was the status quo, whereas Bernie was not. So it's not totally analogous. Lula would have won to Bernie would have won. You know what I'm saying? You see?
Right. To me, exactly. To me, it's analogous only in the limited sense that it's a counterfactual, and counterfactuals by their nature are inherently uncertain. That's the only way in which they're analogous. But I think you're exactly right, is that, and Steve Bannon himself said this, when you have this kind of outsider, anti-establishment demagogue like Trump, the thing that they hope and pray for more than anything is that they run against an embodiment of the ruling class and the status quo. And that was what Hillary Clinton was, and that was what Bernie Sanders wasn't.
Yeah.
And if you look at Brazil, even though Lula was popular, it wasn't Lula on the ballot. There was a left-wing candidate who probably could have beaten Bolsonaro, but Lula, and he deserves a lot of blame for this from prison, couldn't give up control of the left. He insisted on choosing his candidate that he would control, a little-known one-term mayor from São Paulo, Haddad. Even though anti-PT sentiment was so high because anti-status quo sentiment was so high, and it's exactly what you just said, PT, because it's been running the country since 2002, with the exception of the last 2 years, is the status quo. It is the ruling class in the minds of millions of people. And so, I think you're exactly right that kind of not just anti-PT vote and anti-left-wing vote, but just anti-establishment vote manifested in a rejection of PT, similar to how it manifested in a rejection of Hillary Clinton.
So was Haddad similar? Was he a very centrist, pro-status quo kind of candidate? But putting aside the fact that he's literally representing that party that is the status quo, did he come across as Clinton-esque, as in very pro-establishment and very centrist?
I mean, it's hard. The reality is that PT maintained this fraud for so long that Lula was going to be the candidate, well after everyone knew that it wasn't going to happen. And it was only once the court ruled that Lula couldn't run did he then handpick Haddad. So Haddad was only a candidate formally for about 6 to 8 weeks.
Oof.
So
nobody even knew him.
No one knew him. He had been a minister in Lula's cabinet, but kind of an obscure technocrat minister. And then he was a one-term mayor of São Paulo, which is Brazil's largest city, but still it's one city. It's like being the mayor of Los Angeles or the mayor of Chicago or the mayor of New York. You're not really well known at all. How well known is Bill de Blasio outside of New York? So and the whole focus the whole time was on Bolsonaro. Kind of like the whole focus was on Trump. So no one really formed an opinion on Haddad. I mean, in reality, he was like Lula and Dilma. He started off very radical in his early youth. He got a PhD, actually, in Marxist economics. But, in his middle age, he's become much more moderate. He's viewed as a moderate within the Workers' Party. He's a professor. He didn't come from poverty. So, no, he wasn't, he was a kind of staid, uncharismatic figure. He's a decent, competent politician, a smart guy. But nothing that would touch or inspire the masses in any way. And even if he were able to do that, he had no time to do it. It was all just, do we want Bolsonaro? Do we want to break from everything we know and go with something radical? Or do we want to stay the same? That's the only question the population ended up answering. Haddad was really a footnote to the entire election.
Now, Lula's successor, Dilma Rousseff, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I know... years ago, I feel like I've seen you tweet a lot about her and cover her, and she was replaced, and you said that was questionable as well. And isn't it the case that the person who replaced her was even more corrupt than they were even accusing her of being?
Yeah, and this is why Brazilians don't trust politicians or political parties or the government. So in 2016, when Dilma was president and they impeached her based on this very obscure technicality that in the scheme of corruption thriving in Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, was like ignoring mass murder and rape and obsessively, ticketing jaywalkers. I mean, that was literally the analogy that was appropriate. And so what ended up happening was the reason they removed Dilma is because she wasn't doing enough of the austerity, cutting pensions enough, cutting social programs enough. She was doing it some, but not as much as was wanted. And so they replaced her with her vice president. And unlike in the US, where the president and the vice president are of the same party, so if you impeach Donald Trump, you get Mike Pence. In Brazil, because there's 37 parties run people, usually the president and the vice president are from different parties. So the person they replaced her with, Michel Temer, is kind of from the centrist party, and he formed a coalition with the center-right that imposed austerity, that cut programs that Dilma wasn't willing to cut, and just basically governed the way banks and the market wanted them to. During the time that he was in office, and remember, he's in office, no one knows who he is, he could never have gotten elected on his own, he only got elected as part of this coalition with Dilma. They said to the population, we're taking the person you voted for out of office because she's corrupt, and we're replacing her with somebody you don't know and never would have voted for, but who is at least not corrupt. 6 months into office, tapes were released, audio tapes, of him talking to somebody who, unbeknownst to him, was already under investigation and was cooperating as an informant. And the corruption investigation in which Michel Temer, the president of the country, sitting in the equivalent of the Oval Office, said, we need to pay bribes to these politicians to keep them silent and to impede the investigation, including someone from his party who was already in prison. He said we need to pay bribes to him. They then caught suitcases of cash being carried by that person to exactly the people that Temer had ordered the bribes to be paid for by one of his closest aides. So the whole country heard these tapes. The same Congress that voted to impeach Dilma then had to vote whether or not to impeach Temer. And not only did they vote not to impeach him, even after everybody heard these tapes, they voted to block any investigation or a prosecution of him until he left office. So first you have the left-wing Workers' Party or the center-left party. The population's convinced they're corrupt. They have to be removed from office. And then the center and the center-right that did the removal in the name of corruption and that replaced them not only cut their social programs, but then turned around and protected a real criminal, like an actual gangster, Michel Temer, from any kind of consequences and left him in the presidency for 2 years. So is there any wonder why the same population, when presented with the same center-left, center-right choices that they've been given for the last 20 years and that have destroyed their life and made it so miserable, instead opted for the person who said, I hate all of those people, and they all hate me, and I'm going to burn that entire system down. To me, that's not surprising. It's the opposite of surprising. It seems quite rational, no matter how terrifying and horrifying he actually is.
Yeah, I agree with you. And then that has implications on the strategy to counter it, because as we know in the U.S. context, perhaps, given the facts on the ground that led to Trump, voter shaming isn't the best strategy to try to combat Trump. I actually want to come back to that in a second, something related to that, but I just want to run through real quick some of the other things about Bolsonaro, and I want your opinion as to whether or not you think he'll actually go down this path. He's made comments that were pro-torture. Do you think he'll bring back torture?
Yes, I think that he will bring back torture. He has been extremely consistent about the virtue of it, about the necessity of it, about the nobility of it. The reality is the police here use torture when they capture low-level drug traffickers, even when they capture higher-level dealers. And he has repeatedly said that he condones it. And you don't even have to pass a law allowing it. That's not how it works. You just give the signal to the agents, the security agents of the state, that that's something that they're permitted to do. They can beat suspects. They can torture them in order to extract information. There's little doubt in my mind that they will use it. They're already using it. I think they'll significantly escalate it.
Now, this guy is a notorious homophobe. He's comment after comment I read in that Intercept article where he basically says, you know, I'd beat my son if he was gay. I despise gay people. Do you think, what anti-gay policies do you think he'll implement?
So ironically, the first time I ever wrote about Bolsonaro was in 2014 when he was still kind of obscure, and he had just for the second time told a female colleague with whom he served in Congress, a leftist, that who accused him of defending the use of torture and rape by the dictatorship, which are two of the techniques they use. He said to her, "Oh, you don't have to worry. I would never rape you. You're too ugly to deserve it." And so I wrote an article just kind of saying it's amazing that there's just a member of Congress, let alone the president, but just a member of Congress who's this heinous. And in the course of doing that, we interviewed him. And at that point, one of his main policy goals was that he wanted to ban same-sex couples from adopting. And my husband and I were just about to start the process of getting certified to adopt. And so I knew a lot about adoption. So I asked him, or actually my husband did the interview and David, and he asked him, look, there's, 15,000 children in orphanages all over Brazil, totally impoverished orphanages whose parents are killed or died from disease or drug addicts and incapable of taking care of them. Do you really think it's better that they remain in these impoverished orphanages than be adopted by a loving couple that will give them a home and educational opportunities and a family structure just because the couple is gay? And he said, yes, absolutely. This is an attempt to convert children into the gay lifestyle, basically saying that the gay couples want to indoctrinate children to convert them into being gay so that they can have sex with them, accusing gay people of essentially being pedophiles. And that he wants to ban adoptions. And then he said to David, look, you don't need to worry. If you want to have babies so badly, doctors are soon going to be able to put a uterus in your belly and you'll be able to have all the babies that you want. So, I think that they're going to pass laws preventing the discussion of homophobia, of racism, of misogyny in the public schools. But I do think that one of the first things they're going to try and do is ban adoption by same-sex couples.
That's
hey, Kyle,
devastating. Yeah.
So I just need to stop for 1 second because I actually have to get my power cord. I don't know why the battery is run out this way, but it's going to cut out if I don't get it anyway.
Okay.
So can you just put things on whatever little freeze thing you have, and then I will be right back.
Sure.
We're not live, right?
No, we're not live. No.
Okay, and you're going to be able to edit this, right? So
yes and no. That's a longer conversation.
Well, then you can just chat, and I will be right back.
Okay.
Right?
All right. Sounds good. I'll talk to the people.
Okay.
Yeah. So the reason why I was saying yes and no is that obviously I have the ability to edit, but I wanted to put this up ASAP for everybody because it's a really interesting conversation, and because the situation in Brazil just happened, so I want to get it up as soon as possible. But yeah, I'm learning a lot in this conversation. He knows a lot about Brazilian politics. And yeah, my mind's blown. The more I read about this guy, the scarier it is, because it's almost like if he wasn't disqualified for saying the things he said, then there's nothing that's disqualifying in terms of substance. Like, you can say stuff like, I'm in favor of a dictatorship, and still get elected. So that's scary to me, and you could look at whether it's Erdogan in Turkey or Duterte in the Philippines, or, Sisi in Egypt. There is something that happens when a system is broken and corrupt and the establishment is failing people, where they turn to radical solutions. Sometimes we luck out and it's so-called radical solutions on the left, and other times it's authoritarians on the right. And I think this is a clear case of that, and I think that's the point that Glenn was making repeatedly, that with the system being so broken, it's not surprising that people turn to this strong man who claims to have all the answers. And of course the reality is, with most right-wing authoritarians, it's scapegoating. It's like when Bernie Sanders goes after the elites and the establishment, he means the actual elites and the establishment. He means the moneyed interests. He means capital. He means billionaires. He means corporations, the people who actually rigged the laws in their favor. But when Donald Trump, or a right-wing authoritarian, goes after the elites, they mean more the cultural elites. And they have concocted these crazy theories that, like, you know, in the case of Republicans in the U.S., that, like, Black Lives Matter and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hollywood are all in cahoots and they're secretly controlling everything. And that's just not true. And in the case of Brazil, this guy scapegoats women and minorities, indigenous people, gay people, and it's really, it's not a good situation. And I didn't even read all of the quotes. In fact, I was just going to get to one more quote that I'll ask Glenn about when he comes back. The dude said he wants to kill 30,000 of his political opponents. That's what Bolsonaro said. So I'm going to ask Glenn if he thinks that that's real. If he thinks that he will indeed do that. Because if that's true, I mean, what are we going to call that other than that's genocide? I mean, that's what that is. Duterte, for example, is doing, I would say, a genocide against drug users. You have Myanmar doing a genocide against Rohingya Muslims. Are we going to have lefties in Brazil who are the victim of a genocide from Bolsonaro and his thuggish troops? It's a scary situation, man. So yeah, I'm going to ask him about, I asked him about torture, asked him about anti-gay policies. I'll go on to ask him about theocracy, killing 30,000, cutting social programs, and killer cops. And then I want to end by asking him about the Trump presidency to get his take on that, because I'm very curious what Glenn Greenwald thinks about the Trump presidency. I feel like Joe Rogan right now, because Joe Rogan, you know, when his guest goes to the bathroom and he's just talking. That's how I feel. I feel like Joe Rogan at the moment. My guest is in the bathroom. And I'm over here yapping my trap. Cleaning up my notes so that I could ask the questions in the right order when he comes back. Theocracy. Okay. Got some big seltzer up in this bitch. Every time I drink Polar, I feel bad about it. And I feel bad about it because Vintage was the one that hooked me up. So, Vintage, my heart is with you, but at the moment, Polar's what I have.